So me and my wife, Melina, are first-time homeowners, and that has actually been a really fun season for us, but it's also been really, really scary at times, especially when we get letters in the mail. I don't know, us young people, we don't do well with mail. We like emails and texts and phone calls, and sometimes we'll get letters in the mail that I have no idea what they mean. Last week, day before Christmas Eve, so Christmas Eve, I checked my mailbox and I have this letter from the Little Rock treasurer saying that my real estate taxes were due. So I opened this letter up. I'm looking at this number for our house, and I'm kind of panicking because I thought that was the purpose of your escrow account. I was like, did they not pay it for you? So I'm calling my mom, what any 25-year-old does in that situation. Yeah. Call my mom, and I go online to this website that was on the letter to try to figure out if I need to pay this bill or not. And at the same time, my wife had gotten a package from all of her friends from college that was a collection of Christmas cards. And as I'm looking at the computer trying to figure out if I need to pay this bill or not, Melina is telling me about these Christmas cards and how sweet they are and how thoughtful they are, and I am subconsciously responding. And I know that I was subconsciously responding because of what happened 24 hours later. 10 minutes before we're leaving for Christmas Eve service, my wife comes up to me, and she goes, "Hey, Gary, have you seen the Christmas cards from yesterday?" And then I said the stupidest thing I've ever said in my marriage, which was, "What Christmas cards are you talking about?" Yeah, that was not good for me. So I go into the living room, I start looking for them, and then I remember what they looked like, and I start panicking on the inside because I thought they were trash, and I threw them away. And yeah, I'll let you imagine how that night went for me. Now, in our society today, it is commonly held that the attention span of the average person is decreasing year by year. But as I was doing research for the sermon, I found out that that's actually not true. Our attention spans aren't decreasing, but what is happening is that the society we live in is getting harder and harder to focus in. I read an article by the New York Times that was posted 2 years ago in 2023. And in that article, the author says, most people without chronic attention issues could likely focus fairly well if given a task in a quiet, empty room. But they probably perform worse if they did the same task in a room where people are talking and music is playing. In modern life, we are essentially living in a room filled with distractions all the time. Thanks to the competing demands of work and home life, societal stressors, and the constant temptation of phones, social media, and the internet. And what her and so many other psychologists are saying is that your attention span isn't getting worse. But what's happening is in the world we live in, there are millions of things daily begging for your attention. See if this seems true to you. Imagine that you just got a new book, and it's a book that you've been excited to read for months now. It comes in the mail, and you find yourself in the middle of a Dave & Buster's trying to read this book. And I'm not talking about the restaurant part. I'm talking about the arcade, all the music, the chaos, the yelling, and you're trying to read this book. Imagine how well that would go. You would probably have no idea what you were reading, and you have to reread every sentence. And that's kind of what modern life is like. If I did a poll today, I would guess that 75% to 80% of the people in this room, when you first wake up, there is this pressing temptation to do a few things. Either to immediately go and try to grab your phone because you got to check out what you missed during the night, or you got to go and immediately get in the shower because you got to get a move on with your day. You have things to attend to, things to accomplish, things to get done. For me, oftentimes, the first 10 minutes of my day are sometimes the most stressful parts of my day. And I feel like I'm not the only one in the room like that. And that is a result of the world we live in, which is that there are millions of things begging for our attention. And that's important to see because your life is the sum total of what you give your attention to. If you want to see who you are, if you want to get a glimpse, a picture of what your heart looks like, ask yourself what you attend to on a daily basis, because that is how you can see yourself clearly. There was an author named Winifred Gallagher who wrote a book called Wrapped. And in that book, she said, if you could look backward at your years thus far, you'd see that your life has been fashioned from what you've paid attention to and what you haven't. You'd observe that of the myriad sights and sounds, thoughts and feelings that you could have focused on, you selected a relative few, which became what you confidently called reality. You'd also be struck by the fact that if you had paid attention to other things, your reality in your life would be very different. Attention has created the experience and significantly the self stored in your memory. What she's saying is that in every situation, including the one you're in right now, there are multiple things that you could focus on. And depending on what you focus on, depending on what you give your attention to, will determine how you experience the situation you are in. And this essentially is what Jonathan has said over and over again in the past few weeks in his How to Happy series, which is the circumstances, the situations, the things we find ourselves in aren't what determine our inner peace, our inner happiness, or our joy, or our contentment. It's not our circumstances, but it's actually what you give your attention to, what you focus on amidst those circumstances. What you give your attention to is of critical importance, and there's nothing more important to see that in the world we live in. So what do we do as Christians? What do we give our attention to on a daily basis? That's what I want to look at today. And to do that, we're going to be in the book of Psalms, looking at one verse in Psalm 119, verse 37. So if you have your Bible, I'm going to turn Psalm 119, we're going to be verse 37. And Scripture reads, "Turn my eyes from looking at worthless things and give me life in your ways." One small verse, and there's three things I want to point out, three movements that I want to show you from this one verse. The first movement is something that we do, and the second and third movement is something that God does in us. So the first movement comes from that first phrase, which is, "Turn my eyes." And what I want you to notice that this is simply a prayer. The psalmist recognizes the reality he lives in, the situation that he lives in, the temptation to give his attention to things that don't mean anything. So he goes to the Lord in prayer and he says, "Lord, turn my eyes." And that word "turn" in the Hebrew is actually really interesting, because in the Old Testament, there is a word used that means to turn, that's used everywhere. And you would expect that to be used here, but it's not. It's actually a word, it's pronounced abar. Can you say that with me? Abar? Abar. And it means kind of like to pull violently one thing off of something and onto another. So what the psalmist is doing here is he's going to the Lord and he's saying, "Lord, will you violently pull my eyes off of what he calls worthless things and put them on things that will give me life?" And the picture that comes up into my head when I read this verse is almost like a drug addict. Imagine in your life you have a family friend or a family member, a close friend that has an addiction, whether that's substance abuse with drugs or alcohol, and you realize that it's time to get them help. The very first thing that you have to do to get them help is to sit them down and to have what we call an intervention. And in an intervention, what you are doing is you are turning their eyes, you are turning their attention from the pleasure of the drug, and you're turning it away from that and trying to show them the damage that the drug is doing in their lives and their relationships. Does that make sense? You're turning their attention from here to here. And that is what the psalmist is coming to the Lord and asking for. "Lord, will you turn my attention from what he calls worthless things?" Now, how in the world does the Lord actually do this? How does the Lord turn our heads from looking at worthless things to things that give us life? Well, he does two things. The first is that he shows us the quality of the things that the things that are begging for our attention. Now, the word here for worthless, it's kind of depicting something that appears to be full of life, something that is powerful to give you joy, something that is able to give you peace, something that's able to give you life on the outside. But once you get a hold of it on the inside, you realize that it's actually empty. It's vanity. Me and Melina, we went to Kroger a few weeks ago to grocery shop. And while we were in Kroger, I found an aisle that was almost like heaven on earth, which was canned soup. And yes, I just told you I'm a youngest sibling without telling you I'm a youngest sibling. We found this canned soup aisle, and I'm so pumped. Like, this is the greatest thing I've ever discovered in a grocery store. So I see this can of chicken noodle soup. I tell Melina we have to buy this. We go home, and as soon as we get home, I get our can opener. I open it up. I pour it out. And as I'm pouring it out, disappointment sets in. Because, I'm not kidding, literally 5 noodles and a piece of chicken came out of this can. Yeah. And the rest was chicken broth. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, it felt full, it looked full, but in reality, it was worthless. It was empty. And there are so many things in our life that are like this. Maybe it's your career. Maybe it's this idea of retirement. For young people, maybe it's this idea of marriage. Things that we look at and we think, if I could just have that, then I can have life. If I can just have that, then I can have peace. If I can just have that, then I can be content. But in reality, all of these things may appear full, but when you get them, they're worthless. And the way that the Lord shows us that, the way he showed me that at least, time and time again, is by letting me get those things. I'm sure there are many of you who spent years chasing after something, and you finally got it, and you realized it's done absolutely nothing for your soul. How much of our lives do we spend running after what we call worthless things? And the Lord, in his grace, lets us get them so that we can look elsewhere. Now, the second thing that the Lord does to turn our eyes, to turn our attention from worthless things, is that he shows us the quality, the abundance of life that comes from his ways. The abundance of life. Now, what are his ways? The psalmist is definitely referring to the Exodus and the giving of the law in the book of Exodus, but he doesn't have the New Testament. So I'm going to depart from him here for a bit, because if he knew what we knew about God now, he would be jealous. In church, I have this conviction. I am totally convinced that if you want life, there is one thing to focus on. There is one thing to give your full attention to daily. And that thing is what Jesus saw as the most important part of his life, which was his cross. I know that's a big statement, that Jesus saw the cross as the most important aspect of his life. And I want to show you why that's true with 2 things. The first is if you've ever read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll notice this really interesting story, kind of backstory that's going on, which is Jesus at first is really, really hesitant to share his identity with people. Like he's a closed door with his identity. Particularly in Mark 8, halfway through the book of Mark, there's a moment where Peter for the first time confesses Jesus as Lord. And here's what happens. If you can put that passage up in Mark 8. It says that Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And then immediately after Peter says that, Jesus says, and Jesus strictly charged them to tell no one about him. That's the same word that's used for Jesus telling the storms to be quiet. Jesus is, with a divine command, telling Peter and his disciples, you will tell no one about my identity. And when I was in college, I struggled with this. Like, Jesus, why are you being secretive about who you are? Don't you want everyone to know that you're the Messiah? Don't you want everyone to see who you are and come to faith in you? I used to wrestle with this until I realized that the answer to why Jesus was concealing his identity comes immediately after the next 2 verses. When this happens, in verses 31 through 32, Scripture reads, "And Jesus began to teach them that the Messiah, the Son of Man, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And after 3 days rise again." And he said this plainly. And then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Here in this moment, Jesus' closest disciple, one of his closest friends, totally misunderstands the mission of Jesus. No one could understand a Messiah that has to suffer. But Jesus knew that he was no Messiah unless he did suffer. Does that make sense? The identity of Jesus, the identity of Christ was tied into his cross, which tells us that his cross was the most essential aspect to his ministry. Now, the second way that we can see that the cross is the most central aspect to the mission of Jesus, which I love this, is asking the question, who actually killed Jesus? Who killed Jesus? I mean, if you read the Gospels, there's this chain of events that happens. It starts with this guy named Judas. And we know from the Gospels that Judas was a greedy man. And an opportunity arises where he can sell out Jesus or betray Jesus for some money. And he does it. And so the text reads that he hands Jesus over, he betrays Jesus, and he hands him to the religious leaders. But right before he does, Jesus looks at him and says, Judas, it would have been better if you had never been born. And what Jesus is saying there is, Judas, you are responsible, partly responsible for my death. You are going to be one of the people that killed me. But that's not all, because Judas hands him over to the religious leaders. And when Jesus is in front of the religious leaders, they put him on a false trial. They bring in false witnesses. They accuse him of blasphemy and of things like threatening to destroy the temple in 3 days. And after hours of this, Jesus has enough, and finally he just says, I am the Son of God. And they rip their clothes because they have heard enough. This is blasphemy. We don't need witnesses anymore. We are the witnesses, unless Jesus was telling the truth. But they didn't care about the truth. Because the Gospels also tells us that these people were envious of Jesus. They were envious of his influence. They were envious of his power. They were envious of his authority. So they didn't care if he was the Son of God or not. They just wanted him out of the way. And so they do what Judas does. They hand him over. It's the same Greek word. They hand him over to Pilate. And then Pilate, you have to feel for him. He's in this situation. He knows Jesus is innocent. But he also knows he can't let him go. Because if he does and a revolt happens, then that's Pilate's job. That's Pilate's head. So Pilate, who's a coward, does what Judas did, does what the religious leaders did, and he hands Jesus over. But right before he does, Jesus looks at him and says, Pilate, the people who handed me over to you are guilty of a greater sin. Again, saying that you're responsible and the religious leaders are responsible for my death. And then the Roman soldiers get him, and they crucify him. They nail his hands to a tree. And on the cross, Jesus cries out, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And again, that implies responsibility. So the question, who killed Jesus? Well, it's obvious. Judas killed Jesus. The religious leaders killed Jesus. Pilate killed Jesus. Rome killed Jesus. Everybody killed Jesus. Yet, no one killed Jesus. No one. Because as Jesus says, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down on my own accord. Paul gets this in the New Testament. In the book of Romans, he writes, Romans 8, he says, He who did not spare his own son, God the Father, but gave him up for us all. That's the same word that's used for Judas. That's used for Pilate, for the religious leaders who handed him over. Now it's God the Father handing Jesus over for us all. How will he also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And that's not all, because in Galatians, Paul writes, the Son of God, Jesus, the Son, loved me and gave himself for me. So here Paul is saying it wasn't any man that killed Jesus. It was the Father and the Son together in unity who voluntarily gave up their life for the sheep. And what that tells us is that the most important part of the life of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, the identity of mission is all based on the cross. There's nothing greater than the cross, because at the center of God's ways is the cross. It is the turning point of history, the moment death was defeated, the brightest day in the world, though there was darkness. And now Jesus stands today and tomorrow and every day in 2026, and he says, child, if you want life, If you want life, see what I did for you 2,000 years ago. If you want life, see the life that is available in my cross. And can I say, there's nothing like the cross. Do you want self-value? Well, God himself bled for you. Do you want assurance? If God gave up his son for you, how will he not also give you all things? Do you want peace? Do you want joy? Do you want life? Well, it all comes from the cross. You see, at the cross, Jesus was being treated as we deserved for trying to get life from empty things by being emptied himself. And at the cross, Jesus was giving us his full attention because we could never give him his. And once you see that, there is nothing you would rather give your attention to. There's nothing sweeter, there's nothing better, there's nothing more pleasurable than the cross of Christ. So my question for you this morning is the cross everything in your life? As we're about to start the new year, how often, outside of Sundays, are you thinking about the cross? If it's not something that you're doing every moment of every day, pray this prayer of Psalm 119. Lord, turn my eyes from worthless things, from empty things, things that cannot give me life, and set them on your Son who died for me. Imagine if we were a church like this. If we were a church filled with people, overwhelmed with the sweetness and the goodness and the power and the life of the cross. We would be indescribably happy. We would be indescribably thankful. And we would be indescribably effective in reaching a world because we would be so different than the world that we live in. So church, as we're entering into a new year, I want to see lost people come to the Lord. And the way to do that is to be a people of the cross. So my challenge to you, are you a person of the cross? And if you're not, here's a prayer for you. I'm going to invite our prayer teams up to pray. And if you have anything you want to pray about this morning, please come and talk to them. If you want to pray this prayer, these godly men and women would love to pray with you. Now, let's all stand and sing and worship.